Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for the Day of the Dove, which is episode 7 of season 3 of Star Trek the Original Series. This video is a part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Star Trek as determined by my user polls. The episode to win my user poll for Star Trek the Original Series is the Day of the Dove. So the Day of the Dove is the episode where Kirk and crew encountered Kang and the Klingons and his crew, and they get in a kerfuffle, and the Klingons get blamed aboard the Enterprise, where all they materialize, like swords just materialize out of nowhere, and they start fighting each other to endless fights, and they realize this is an alien that's feeding off of their hatred and energy. So Kirk and Kang team up to have a jovial, happy time in order to get the alien to leave the ship. So, this is one of the rare good episodes of season 3, which season 3 of the original series is kind of where the show went about downhill, and it's noted as not being a particularly good season of the original series. This episode is actually quite well liked. I kind of personally noted this is one of the episodes that where the Klingons first really started behaving like Klingons, or at least what we think of in modern days and modern Trek as Klingon culture, because a lot of people forget that through most of the original series, it's not just the fact that the Klingons didn't have the ridged foreheads and didn't actually look like Klingons. In many cases, they didn't behave like Klingons, or at least what we think of now as Klingons. It's funny because the actor who played Koloth, who appeared in the episode The Trouble with Tribbles, he was talking about encounters with fans on the street where fans would go up to him, and he was like, say something, and they say to him like, oh, say something in Klingon, and he's like, I don't know. He never spoke any Klingons. He was just like, oh, my dear Captain Kirk, because that's basically what the character was like. He wasn't, if you go back and watch The Trouble with Tribbles, he wasn't really, the Klingons weren't really anything like how they are thought of in modern times. Now, it is true that the Klingons, for the most part, were basically a Soviet Union analogy. It was a Cold War analogy, with the Federation, of course, taking the analogy part of the United States, since this is an American-centric show that was made in America, and they brought in the Klingons to sort of fill the role of the Soviets. And that's basically all the thought that was put into it, and through most of the original series, their portrayal was a bit inconsistent. Now, I think prior to this episode, the episode that probably most portrayed them as sort of the Klingons we know is the first episode where they first appeared, Errand of Mercy. In that case, they were ruthless. They took prisoners. They conquered planets and talked about ruling with an iron fist. Whereas some other episodes, like The Trouble with Tribbles and Friday's Child, they honestly came off a bit more like Ferengi, like sniveling, conniving, sort of cheating, like used car salesman type. So I think Errand of Mercy and this episode, Day of the Dove, are probably the two episodes of the original series where they most sort of appeared as what we thought of as Klingons. Now, the Klingon language, as well as their foreheads, was first thought up or first portrayed on screen in Star Trek the Motion Picture. And although they only had a brief cameo in that was the first time that we saw them speaking Klingon, and that we saw the ridges and whatnot. But Star Trek 3, The Search for Spock, is what really drove home this sort of culture. It drove home more the warrior culture that we've come to know, and their language, and especially their look with the forehead. So that's what really drove home what audiences would think of as Klingons. And then the Star Trek Next Generation, which came out shortly after, a few years after Star Trek 3, cemented this and really ran with Search for Spock's portrayal of Klingons and expanded upon this. And of course, Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, Voyager would all go on to really delve deep into Klingon culture, and it was all sort of based off of their portrayal in The Search for Spock. Now, I bring all that up because I think, as I said, I think this episode, their portrayal in this episode of The Day of the Dove, is the closest to what became Klingon culture, because we do see that they are a warrior-based culture who would rather die than surrender. In fact, one of the lines that I thought was sort of most telling is when Kirk surrenders. Of course, he's tricking. He surrenders, but King is like, you're so weak. I would have never surrendered under any circumstances. And just the whole portrayal of King throughout this episode is very reminiscent of the sort of rigidness and honor base, although they never say honor in this episode, but you could tell they do have a code where they look out for another and they sort of hate their enemies. And you get that sense of that character throughout this episode. So I think this is the only episode of the original series that most represents what Klingons actually have become later in the franchise. As I said, the second runner-up to this would be Errand of Mercy. But that, in that case, even though Kor was, as I said, ruled with an iron fist and ruthless, but he did come off more as a sort of evil dictator type who didn't really have a moral code and was just doing things because he wanted to, and he was being self-centered, and he's just an evil guy. Whereas here, it did feel like Kang had a moral code that he was being true to, so it felt more like the Klingons Now, I know an obvious sort of counter-argument to that is that, well, they're just a different kind of Klingons, because we've seen different types of Klingons throughout the entire Star Trek franchise, some honorable, some less honorable, like Duras being one of the less honorable, more conniving type, and someone like Gowron, who's also a dirty politician, is also a bit conniving, and then we see some really honorable ones, of course, like Worf. Now, but I think the portrayal of the original series Klingons go beyond that. Like, they just, at least Duras and Gowron and the characters like that, I think, are still identifiable as Klingons. They still live by the Klingon code, where I think some of the, especially like the Koloth and Tribbles and that Klingon who was in Friday's Child, absolutely were nothing like Klingons. Don't even get me started on the portrayal of Kahless and the episode Savage Curtain. Help me, Spock! Like, that's, no. I won't even touch that. That's ridiculous. But yeah, so, and it's interesting, it should be, worth noting that the characters of King, Koloth, and Kor were brought back in Deep Space Nine. Now, Kang and Koloth only appeared in that one episode, Blood Oath, in which they both died. But I felt the portrayal of Kang, and this is what really drove home to me that the Day of the Dove and Kang's portrayal in the Day of the Dove was the most sort of true to Klingons, is that in that episode, Kang felt like the character who was most consistent with his portrayal in the original series, where Kor, again, was second. He had that same sort of cavalier attitude, but I think they adjusted it and tweaked it slightly to make it fit more in the Klingon ethos, whereas his portrayal in Errand of Mercy was a bit more sort of ruthless and sort of Genghis Khan-esque, rather than sort of fitting into what we now know as Klingon culture. But Koloth was by far he was absolutely nothing, zero, like his portrayal in the original series, and I'm sure the actor who portrayed him would say that himself, that he had to do a completely different performance for that episode to be a Klingon, because my dear Captain Kirk, like, there's nothing like what Klingons have been betrayed. And this is fine, because it's a franchise that's been going on for 50 plus years now, and it's constantly tweaking, and they weren't that consistent with in the original series, because it was a different time. Like, they had no idea this was going to spin off into a huge franchise that would be ongoing, so it's completely understandable. But it's just more of how the later series had to deal with these inconsistencies. But speaking of consistency, I will mention this is a case, and this is a rare case in the original series, where they actually do reference other series, because they did note in this episode that there had been a peace treaty between the Klingons and the Federation for 3 years. This, of course, is a reference to the Organian peace treaty that was first signed in the episode Errand of Mercy. So that's a rare sort of callback and continuity within the original series itself. So that was very much appreciated. Now, as for this episode itself, it's a pretty simplistic episode. I think it's enjoyable on the face of it. I mean, the social commentary is obvious and in your face, but that seemed commonplace for the third season, because this is the season that also featured "Let That Be Your Last Battlefield." And it's a consistent commentary that the original series and Star Trek in general made. Particularly the original series made this the most, that war is bad and something to be avoided at all costs. And of course, the title of the episode, Day of the Dove, would sort of imply that. Now, that's to say that, because throughout the episode, the various characters on both sides, and I do like how this, unlike the other portrayals of the Klingons, particularly Errand of Mercy, although Errand of Mercy tried to sort of bring it together and have the peace, but the Klingons were definitely more antagonizing, or more of the antagonist in that episode. Where here, I was trying to see things from both sides, where both sides sort of had sort of their misconceptions on what the other side was like. Now, granted, the Klingons' misconception on the Federation was worse, whereas the woman actually thought that they, tortured people to death and had death camps and all that, which is, of course, completely misconstrued. And Kirk was saying, "Oh, you're listening to propaganda." And again, I think they're going more into the Cold War analogy there. But how basically they both had reasons to mistrust each other. Like, Kang actually believed that Kirk attacked his ship and killed most of his crew, which of course wasn't true. It was the bleeding, alien thingy that did that. And Kirk believed that Kang killed and destroyed his Federation colony, which apparently never even existed, which, I don't know, that's a bit of a stretch to buy this is alien can pull this off, but whatever on that one. And the whole thing, how the alien convinced Chekhov that he had a brother that he never had. Like, stuff like that is a bit far-fetched, but whatever. It sort of shows how on both sides they had reason to mistrust each other, and how they were both sort of wanted to attack each other and had hatred for each other, and that's what the thing fed off of. It fed off of the mutual hatred, so it was only a mutual armistice or peace of them coming together. Like, both sides had to agree to this in order to defeat this creature. Now, of course, then that makes this creature an analogy for the horrors of war and the dangers of war. That, because in real life there's no alien, there's no creature that's egging people to fight and feeding off of this hatred, but it's an analogy for the damage of war that's caused, and that people need to learn that by they're only feeding this, fictitious analogy that's of destruction that just makes things worse, and that they have to find a way to set aside their grievances. And also, like, it reminds me of sort of the perpetual Thinking of ancient conflicts, there's a few on Earth, a couple that are pretty obvious, that just go on and on and on for centuries, where people just can't let things go. And they kind of touched on that a bit here, where, I think Kirk even brings up, like, why we're angry at them, and McCoy's like, well, if they didn't do this, then they did that, and there's like a whole history of reasons, but when you boil down to it, it's just fighting for the sake of fighting, which is what the creature feeds off of. So in that way, it kind of reminded me of the Deep Space Nine episode Battle Lines, which also touched on this topic a bit. So it is quite simplistic, and it's throughout the episode. It is, they're fighting and they're egging on the fighting. Like some people like Chekhov and Scotty every once in a while get really pissed off, and then McCoy like flipped out at one point. Those savages, blah blah blah. How could you consider making truce? But it works. Just because it's simplistic doesn't mean it's bad. It's actually quite good. The characters are dynamic, and as I said, the Klingons are portrayed as more three-dimensional and people that you can identify with, and that have their own motivations and are not just there to twirl their mustache. It is, in my opinion, the best portrayal of the Klingons in the original series, and it is, of course, even if the commentary is a bit obvious and on the nose, it is still relevant and powerful, and something that's good. Now, the whole thing about this alien and all of the specific things, such as the Enterprise like shooting towards the edge of the galaxy, like as soon as that happened when I was watching, I was like, how did they know that's going towards the edge of the galaxy? Because that's like a long way away. So there's a lot of things in between there and then. So how can they just automatically deduce, oh, they're pushing us out towards the edge of the galaxy? Although in the original series, they actually left the galaxy a couple times, which is very inconsistent with how we portray, how the maps or whatever are set up in the future of Star Trek, where the edge of the galaxy is very, very far away from where the Federation sits, like years travel away. And so the original series, of course, had none of this lore had been established at this point in time, so it plays very fast and loose with these sort of things. So it's just something you gotta accept and roll with. But there's a lot of sort of things, such as the whole Piotr thing that I mentioned, which seems very far-fetched, that the alien was able to convince Chekhov he had a brother he never had. And the way, like, Sulu said, oh, Chekhov doesn't have a brother, and Kirk's immediately jumped to is, oh, well, why does he think he has a brother? What's making him think he has a brother he never had? He never stopped to consider, well, maybe Chekhov just never told you, Sulu, about his brother because it was just something too personal and private. He immediately jumped to, well, something's controlling his mind, which is actually a bit far-fetched, but of course it goes along with the plot. So, but whatever, like a lot of stuff like that, and there was actually a lot more that I can't remember, which seemed a bit contrived and not very, sort of realistic, but I'm willing to go with it. For one, it's the original series, and the original series did this enough, but for two, like, you had to get to the main point of the story, which is that these two warring factions need to make peace, and that their fighting is actually feeding their own destruction. And of course, this episode manifests that destruction in the form of this alien that literally feeds off of their hatred and their fighting. But it's a great analogy for any sort of conflict, that any sort of hatred, or even if you believe is well justified or well earned, is only feeding the destruction, and war is actually something that should be avoided at all costs. And that, I think, is actually portrayed very well. And as I said, have seen both sides of the coin, even though the Klingons were sort of more they used the word hunter rather than warrior in this episode, but, close enough. They're portrayed more as the warrior type. But even so, they have their own sort of motivations and their own culture and civilization to worry about, and they're not just cardboard cutout villains to be defeated. and it's something actually people that need to be reasoned with. So I love that. So I think this is a very effective episode. So my rating for Day of the Dove out of 10 is a 9. Excellent. I do think this is one of the better episodes of season 3, which is rare because season 3 didn't have that many good episodes. This one was actually really good, and as I said, I think it's the best portrayal of the Klingons in the original series, and one of the better examples of the war is bad commentary, which the original series did a lot. I think this is actually one of the better ones, even though it's quite in your face and on the nose. I find it still very effective. Anyway, so that is it for my review of Day of the Dove. I shall return with the rest of my Star Trek reviews for all the other polls that I ran. So be sure to check that out. Also check out my channel as I cover many more Star Trek videos and other shows like Discovery, The Expanse, Breaking Bad, The Outer Limits, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.